In this lesson, we'll begin our discussion of the cellular level of organization. We'll do a little introduction on cells, but the main focus of this lesson is going to be looking at the structure of the plasma, or also known as the cell membrane, right? You can use those interchangeably. So just to review for a moment from other previous lessons, the levels of organizations. Right? So the level of organization starts at the simplest level, which is the chemical level. Chemicals become cells, all right? So that's going to be our next couple lessons where we'll talk about cells, and then cells will become tissues. So we'll work our way into tissues, right? So a little bit about the cell theory. Cells are the building blocks of all organisms, right? Whether we're humans or animals or plants, right? All organisms have cells as their main building blocks. Now, where do these cells come from, right? We have a bunch of these cells. Where'd they come from? We originally started out as one cell. Let's take a look. Let's say when we were conceived, right? This was our first cell. That first cell divides to eventually become two cells, right? So that one cell divides to become two new cells. We actually call these daughter cells. Then these cells divide into more cells. So this one here on the right will divide into two cells. This one here on the left will divide into two cells. So now we have four cells, and they further divide, right? And it continues to divide and divide until we are an adult and we have, let's say, 75 trillion cells, right? So all of our cells that we have today come from pre-existing cells. They actually come from that very first cell. Now, cells are the smallest units that perform, all vital physiological functions, right? So they sustain themselves. They were able to keep themselves alive. What do I mean by that? We take a look over here. All right, so cells are the smallest living units that carry out all vital, right, necessary for life functions. For instance, here's a cell bringing in nutrients, maybe glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, things that we studied in previous lessons, oxygen, right? And then they goes through metabolism, right? We can metabolize these nutrients and oxygen, and we can produce as a byproduct waste products, carbon dioxide, maybe even energy like ATP, right? So the cell can carry out all of these vital functions on its own. Each cell also maintains homeostasis, right? If you remember back from our very first lesson, homeostasis is that state of balance, right? So they have the ability to correct any changes that take place in the cell and reestablish that homeostasis, that state of balance. Now, here's a definition we've actually done before also. Cytology, if you were going to study cytology, is the study of cells. Now, we can group cells into two basic categories. The first category here we want to highlight are the sex cells. These are also known as germ cells or reproductive cells. That would include the sperm and what we call the oocyte, right? Commonly we call it the egg, even though the egg is not the correct terminology, but it is something that laymen use. We really want to call them oocytes. These are the sex cells. These are not going to be studied this semester in A&P 1. These are things that we study more in anatomy and physiology 2. The cells that we will be looking at mostly this semester in A&P 1 are what we call somatic cells. This word somatic is very important. Somatic means body, right? So this includes, if you want to highlight, all of the body cells, right? So all the cells that make up our frame, our body, are known as somatic cells. Right? And again, like I said, that's going to be the focus of A&P 1. Okay, so let's take a look now at how the cell is put together. We're going to divide the cell basically into three parts. The first part is the plasma or the cell membrane. Right? That's going to be the focus of this lesson. Then in subsequent lessons, we'll take a look at the cytoplasm. So that's part number 2. And then part number 3 is the nucleus. Right? So 1, 2, 3. We'll see in subsequent lessons that the cytoplasm contains the cytosol, which is like a watery part, and these little like baby organs that have different functions known as organelles, right? So both of those are within the cytoplasm. And then the nucleus you can almost think of as the brain of the cell. It's going to kind of control cell function, that type of thing. This is where we find our chromosomes and our genes. We'll talk about that also in a subsequent lesson. All right, so for this lesson, we're going to focus just on number 1, the structure of the plasma membrane. So here's a diagram that shows a cell with all the possibilities. For instance, the reddish area out here is going to be the plasma membrane. Then if you look on the inside, this is all going to be the cytoplasm, right? That has watery part would be like over here, the cytosol, and then all these colored looking things here, dots and all that stuff, all these things are the organelles. All right, so that's what we're going to study in subsequent lessons. You'll notice the organelles that are they have like yellow highlights right here. These are what we call non-membranous organelles, where the ones that are in blue boxes are membranous organelles. All right, we'll get into that excuse me, in subsequent lessons. And then over here they're showing the nucleus. Yeah, so we'll refer to this picture quite frequently. But let's take a look at the plasma membrane. So there's 2 fluids. We've done this in previous lessons. The fluid outside of the cell is known as the extracellular fluid, right? Extra being basically meaning outside the cell. We could also call it interstitial fluid. This is the watery medium that surrounds the cell. Now, the plasma membrane or the cell membrane basically is separating the water of the cytoplasm from the extracellular fluid. If we were in a room, a classroom, let's say, and if the classroom represented the cell, the 4 walls, the ceiling, and the floor would be the plasma membrane. That is keeping the water inside the room separate from the water, let's say, in the hallway of the building. Okay, so it's going to separate the water of the cytoplasm from the extracellular fluid. Right, so here's that picture again, and you can see I just kind of highlighted here. Here's the plasma membrane. We folded it back, but all of this here, guys, this would be all plasma membrane. Okay, it surrounds the whole cell. Again, if this was a room, the 4 walls, the floor, and the ceiling would be the plasma membrane. So let's take a look at the functions of the plasma membrane. It has a number of functions. Number 1 is basically what I mentioned already. It causes or results in physical isolation. Think of the cell membrane, excuse me, as a barrier, right? It is separating the water of the cytoplasm. We could also call that the intracellular fluid, right? We abbreviate that ICF, intracellular fluid, from the water outside the cell, which is the extracellular fluid. Okay, so that's an important function. It's a barrier. Now, even though it's a barrier, the cell membrane does allow things to move in and out. So the cell membrane does regulate the exchange with the environment. For instance, ions, things like calcium, let's say, and nutrients, things like glucose, can enter the cell, but waste products can be eliminated, right? We don't want to keep these waste products inside the cell. We want to get rid of them. So an example of that would be CO2, right? Carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is an important slide. It's a physical barrier, but even though it's a barrier, it does allow some things to come in and other things to leave. The third function, right? Since the cell membrane is facing the extracellular fluid, this is the first part of the cell that is affected by changes in the extracellular fluid. So as things are changing, whether it's ion concentration, water concentration, it is the cell membrane that is sensing these changes. It also, the cell membrane, as far as sensitivity, can receive signals from other cells which alter the behavior of the cell. This is a little bit advanced, but think about a hormone, right? When a hormone is produced by an endocrine gland, right? So the cells of an endocrine gland, they release this hormone that go to another cell. These hormones affect the behavior of the cell. But where is the hormone going, right? Oftentimes it's going to the cell membrane. The fourth function of the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is basically going to be support, right? It's going to help to anchor the cell to other cells and even to produce tissues. Right? And we'll actually look at that, excuse me, how it's done in other lectures, right? In subsequent lectures. Okay, so these are important slides. The functions, again, it acts as a physical isolation, but it does allow things to pass through, so it does regulate the exchange of materials through the cell membrane. It is sensitive to the environment, all right, so it's monitoring changes that take place in the ECF, and it also is going to provide structural support. So as far as the actual structure of the plasma membrane, this is a relatively thin membrane. It's anywhere from 6 to 10. NM stands for nanometers. So it's extremely thin. If we were to look at what makes up the cell membrane, we'll see that it's made up of things that we know from previous lessons. Lipids, which are like fats, proteins, and carbs, which are sugars, right? We're going to take a look at each one of these, the lipids, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. Let's start with the lipids. Right, so lipids by percentage form the most of the plasma membrane. This is what we're going to see the most, and I'll show you this on a picture. There are three types of lipids that we actually studied in biochemistry, the biochemistry part of chemistry. There are phospholipids, if you want to highlight right here, cholesterol, and then we just kind of mentioned glycolipids. I'll show you what they look like again. So the phospholipids, they form something known as the phospholipid bilayer. If you remember, I took this slide from our chemistry section. This top part here is a phosphate head. All of this is this phosphate head. And then there are two fatty acid chains. And if you remember, this straight one here was a saturated fatty acid. How do we know that? It was all single bonds. And then the one that's bent over here had a double bond. All right, and that's this chain right over here. So we also had said back then that this top part here is hydrophilic, meaning that it is attracted to water. But the oily part, right, the fatty acid chains, they don't like water. They were hydrophobic. So it's interesting. What happens if we take this molecule and a whole bunch of them and we throw them into water? They're going to orient themselves so that the top part here faces water, but the two fatty acid tails don't. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. I just wanted to review with you what the phospholipid looks like. Right? So the phospholipid forms this phospholipid bilayer. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But remember that the one part of the phospholipid is a hydrophilic part, right? We call that the hydrophilic head, right? When we throw this phospholipid in water, these are going to face outward on both sides. They're going to always face the water, where the hydrophobic fatty acid tails are going to be inside the cell membrane. Let's take a look. All right, so this is the phospholipid. We'll take a look at cholesterol in a minute. So watch this, guys. Let's just say we have 2, 4, 6 phospholipids here and 6 phospholipids down here. Let's just say before we put them in water, we just had them individually. Now we tossed all 12 of those phospholipids in a beaker of water. Watch what happens. These phospholipid heads, right? The phosphate heads up here. These are hydrophilic. They're going to face water. So let's just say right here where my arrow is, this is the water on the outside of the cell, the extracellular fluid. Then these phosphate heads, excuse me, they're going to face where this kind of tan area is. This would be the water inside the cell. But notice the fatty acid tails, they face each other, right? They don't face water. They were hydrophobic. So this whole thing is what our cell membrane looks like, okay? How does that fit here? So watch this. Here's the fluid inside the cell. The blue is the fluid outside the cell. So notice each one of these is a building block. This is the phospholipid. The phosphate heads, which are hydrophilic, they like water. What are they facing? The water here on the inside. These phosphate heads, they're facing the water on the outside. Okay, so notice always the phosphate heads face water. But look at the hydrophobic tails, right? The fatty acid tails. They do not face water. They're facing the inside of the cell membrane, right? And they face each other. So we call this a phospholipid bilayer. Bi meaning two, right? There's a 1, 2. Okay? So this is important. The phospholipids, again, I'm going to repeat everything again, form a phospholipid bilayer. The hydrophobic or hydrophilic heads, excuse me, the hydrophilic heads of the phospholipid, they're always going to face outward. They're going to face the ECF and the ICF, right? The ECF is the extracellular fluid, and they face the intracellular fluid. While the hydrophobic fatty acid tails, they face each other. And that is what we have our call is the phospholipid bilayer. Now, another lipid that makes up the cell membrane is cholesterol. This is actually pretty important. This helps to give the plasma membrane some support, some structure, right? So it doesn't just kind of become floppy. So it helps to stiffen the plasma membrane and also makes the plasma membrane less fluid and a little bit less leaky, less permeable. So let's look at what cholesterol looked like. If you remember from our chemistry section, the biochemistry section, chemistry had steroids or cholesterol had 1, 2, 3, 4 rings. Okay, so we actually looked at this real briefly. This is what cholesterol looks like. So how does that fit into the phospholipid bilayer? So here's our phospholipid bilayer. So notice these yellow structures, guys, this represents the cholesterol. How do I know that? 1, 2, 3, 4 rings, right? So this is a cholesterol molecule right here. Then there's another one here. So they're kind of interspersed. Let's take a look. So if you notice, here's your phospholipid bilayer. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side, then 4 down over here. You'll see the cholesterols are kind of spread apart or spread about the inside of the cell membrane. Why are they on the inside is steroids are a fat. They are also hydrophobic, right? So they're away from water, right? So they're going to be inside the cell membrane. The third of the lipids are the glycolipids. We had just kind of mentioned these casually. These are carbohydrates attached to the lipid. So let's look at that again. We had done this back in the biochemistry part of chemistry. So here's a phospholipid, and then here's a glycolipid. So notice these hexagons right here kind of represent sugar, right, like glucose. So these are carbohydrates with 2 fatty acid tails. And we saw that these also were hydrophilic. These are hydrophobic. These are also interspersed within the phospholipid bilayer. This diagram doesn't show it. It's a little bit advanced. They're just showing you the phospholipids. But the glycolipids would be stuck in there also. There's not nearly as many glycolipids as there are phospholipids. Right, so this is just a more simplified version without the glycolipids, but they are in there. Okay, so this is an important slide. The membrane lipids include three types of lipids: the phospholipids, which make up the phospholipid bilayer. Again, that's all based on the fact that the head of the phospholipid likes water, it's hydrophilic, while the fatty acid tails don't like water. Then there's also cholesterol. Its job is to stiffen the cell membrane, right? Give it more support. Also make it less fluid-like, give and less permeable. Permeable would be like leaky. We don't want it to be too leaky. And then also there are glycolipids. Right? So phospholipid, just a review. Cholesterol, right, which is a type of steroid, right? We know that by 1, 2, 3, 4 rings. Here's what the phospholipid molecule looks like alone, and here's a glycolipid. Now, again, we're not seeing the glycolipid on the diagrams. That is a little bit advanced, but they are there. Right, here's the phospholipid bilayer, and here's the whole kind of picture of a cell membrane. You can see this whole cell membrane here, all these phosphate heads facing the extracellular fluid, all these phosphate heads facing the inside of the cell. Okay. Our cell membrane is also made up of proteins. So we can categorize two classes of proteins. Proteins that are located within the cell membrane are known as integral, right? Think of them as in right here. So these are going to be within the cell membrane. Some of the proteins actually go across the entire cell membrane. Those we call transmembranous. So watch this, guys. If you take a look here, phospholipid bilayer, right? That's going to be the lipids with cholesterol. But see this big blue thing right here? This is a protein. Notice it goes from the outside of the cell membrane to the inside of the cell membrane. So it is an integral protein, right? It's within, but since it spans the whole cell membrane, we call it a transmembrane protein. Some people say transmembranous, right? These are integral proteins that extend across the entire plasma membrane. Okay, so integral proteins are within the cell membrane, plasma membrane. If the integral membrane goes across the entire cell membrane, we call it transmembranous. There are ones that do not go in across; they only go partially. Right? This picture is not showing it, but that type exists also. It would be within, but not across the whole thing. Before I go back to the notes, other proteins are up against the cell membrane. So look at this protein here. Notice it's not in the cell membrane. It's kind of up against the inside of the cell membrane. So this one here, this blue line right here, this would be a protein. These, since they're not in the cell membrane, we classify these as peripheral proteins, right? So they're going to be up against or close to the cell membrane, and that's our second one, right? The peripheral proteins are bound to the inner and outer surfaces of the membranes. By far, we have many more integral proteins than peripheral proteins. Okay, so integral proteins, again, within the cell membrane. Here's another one. If it extends all the way across, it is an integral protein, but it's transmembranous. Right? Here's another example, just different types of proteins. Right? We'll look at some of these as we go on in our studies. So, since there's all these different types of proteins in the cell membrane, let's take a look at their function. One type of protein that's in the cell membrane is known as an anchoring protein. Some people call them stabilizers. These basically function in attaching the plasma membrane to other structures in the body. For example, how about one cell just being attached to its neighbor, right? So that's my example here. These anchoring proteins can attach one cell attached to an adjacent cell, right? They sometimes function to stabilize the position of the cell, help to hold the cell in place. Inside the cell, anchoring proteins are actually attached to something known as the cytoskeleton. We're going to get into this in the next lesson. The cytoskeleton is a bunch of different types of fibers that kind of form like the skeletal system of the cell. These anchoring proteins are actually attached to this skeletal system of the cell. So we'll get more into that in the next lesson. There are proteins that are known as recognition proteins. These basically identify the cell as normal or abnormal to our immune system, right? If the cell becomes abnormal, these proteins will kind of alert the immune system that the cell is abnormal, and the immune system hopefully will get rid of that cell. Some proteins act as enzymes. Right? We know from previous lessons that enzymes catalyze chemical reactions. So there's different types of enzymes that can catalyze chemical reactions in the extracellular fluid, right? The fluid outside of the cell membrane, or chemical reactions inside the cell. That would be the cytosol or the intracellular fluid. Now, these are important. There's a bunch of different proteins that act as receptors. Their job is to receive things. So as different things come to the cell, the receptors receive it. So we have a word for things that come to the cell. We call them ligands. If you want to give that word a highlight right here. A ligand is anything that comes to the cell. It could be an ion, like calcium. Or it could be a hormone like maybe insulin. Okay, so there are receptors that receive different substances known as ligands. All right, this is an important part of anatomy, physiology, and even pathology. Okay, so we have anchoring proteins, recognition proteins, enzymes, receptors, a few more. We also have proteins known as carrier proteins. I'll show you these more specifically in, again, subsequent lessons. Their job is to transport specific solutes through the cell membrane. Let's say things that cannot pass through the cell membrane. We have special proteins that can help move these substances through the cell membrane. Some of these carrier proteins actually require the use of energy to work. We actually have to spend ATP to get the carrier protein to work. So I just want to introduce them today. We will get into them, how they function in subsequent lessons within the cellular level of organization lessons. The last protein I want to mention is known as a channel protein. This is kind of like a carrier protein, except that it has like a central pore, like a tunnel running through it. So it permits the flow of water and other solutes to kind of go in and out of the cell. Right? So this is kind of just a tunnel if you want to take a look at. Let me show you real quick. Actually, we have one here. So this would be an example of a protein right here, but see how it has a pore running through it like a tunnel? This would be an example of a channel. Right here we can see a channel. Okay. Now, some channel proteins are not just an open tunnel. The tunnel will close and then open. These we call gated channels, right? These are channels which can open or close to regulate the passage of substances. So let me show you that. So here's just a channel that's open. This would be like if you were driving on a highway and there was a bridge, right? You could just kind of go over the bridge from one side to the other. But sometimes there'll be a tunnel, let's say, that has a gate, right? You got to pay a toll, then the gate will open and then you can drive through. So look at this one here, it's closed, right? We would have to open it to allow things to pass through and then it would close up again. This would be an example of a gated channel. But notice, guys, whether it's a gated channel, an open channel, these are proteins that are functioning as carriers or channels. Okay. The third uh, chemical or biomolecule, I should say, that makes up our cell membrane are carbohydrates, right? So we looked at the lipids, we looked at the proteins. Now we want to introduce some carbohydrates. This is not a big percentage of the structure. By far the lipids and the proteins make up most of the cell membrane. Carbohydrates are the least. So this is a combination of biomolecules we've mentioned in previous lessons: proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and glycolipids again. Um, all of these biomolecules here extend outside the cell membrane. So watch this. If we look at our cell membrane, so hopefully this picture is starting to look a little bit more familiar. Here's your phospholipid bilayer, cholesterol, integral proteins here, right? Integral proteins, some peripheral proteins, right? Here's the cytoplasm over here. Here's the extracellular fluid. So see these structures here? These are the glycolipids. Right? How do I know they're glyco means carbohydrate? Remember that sugars we usually draw as these ring structures here. This is glucose, right? These ring structures. Notice these extend outside like an arm, kind of extending into the extracellular fluid. We don't see them on the inside. Right? And that's my comment here. The membrane carbohydrates extend outside the cell membrane. We're only going to see them there. So these membrane carbohydrates form a sticky, sugary coat that we call the glycocalyx. And kind of think about this for a moment. Did you ever get like sugar on your fingers and then your fingers got wet and then the sugar on your fingers became a little bit sticky? So it is a sticky, sugary coat. Let's take a look at some of the functions of this glycocalyx, right? So all of these membrane carbohydrates form the glycocalyx, this sugary coat. Since it's kind of a thick coat, it does, and it's on the outside of the cell membrane, it does act as a lubricant, but it's also a protector because it's a pretty thick coat. Since it's sticky, it will help with anchoring in some cells, but other cells that move around, let's say like a white blood cell, it will assist in locomotion, right? So it's kind of interesting. It has kind of, in one cell, causing it to be anchored, but in another cell, it helps with movement. Think of this. Since it's sticky, it will help with binding. So it's very similar to a protein that is a receptor. Things will stick to the cell membrane. So the glycocalyx can also function as a receptor. And this last one is an important one. This glycocalyx helps with recognition. Um, Everybody's glycocalyx, excuse me, is going to be a little bit different. It's genetically determined. So our immune systems know our own glycocalyx, and that identifies our cells as ours. And this is one of the reasons that people get tissue rejection when they have a transplant. If somebody else's glycocalyx is very different, our immune systems will attack those cells because they don't recognize the glycocalyx. So this is something that you're going to study much more in AMP2 when we study the immune system and how it recognizes its own cells. Okay, so lubrication and protection, anchoring and locomotion, kind of like a receptor, and then also recognition, right? It allows our own immune system to recognize our own cells as ours. Okay, like I said before, the glycocalyx extends on the outside of the cell membrane. Okay, and finally, so our cell membranes are not like very rigid structures. I mean, when you look at the picture, you may think it's a rigid structure. It's actually a fluid structure because most of the membrane lipids and many of the proteins actually move. It's kind of like an ocean. It's like a sea of phospholipids, and then you have these proteins like icebergs just kind of floating around. Or they've actually been able to prove that these proteins actually will move. Membrane lipids and proteins are mobile in their own half of the bilayer. Okay, but remember that cholesterol does help to limit some of that fluidity, right? We don't want things to be too fluid, so the cholesterol will act to stabilize that cell membrane. Okay, so that concludes the anatomy of the cell membrane. In subsequent lessons, we'll take a look at how do structures actually move through that cell membrane. We'll actually apply many of the things that we learned in this lesson.